Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. It's good to see all of you here. My name is Danez Smith, and I'm the director of the Bonham Centre for Sexual Diversity Studies. Welcome to the 9th annual Queer Directions Symposium with this year's theme, Queer and Trans Poetics. I want to begin by thanking the amazing, hardworking team at the Bonham Centre, Brandy Caradonna, Keith Chang, and Christopher Smith for all of their care and labor that went into supporting this event and goes into supporting all of our events every year, so thank you very much. I would also like to thank Martha McCain, yes. Keith, I think you're back there somewhere working stuff, and you're awesome. I would also like to thank Martha McCain and the Global Initiatives Fund that allows us to host Queer Directions every year. And I want to thank our 4 guests for being here with us today, and I'm going to introduce them to you shortly, but everybody, welcome. I want to begin by acknowledging the land we are gathering on today. The University of Toronto, itself a physical and intellectual structure enabled by land theft and the violences of settler colonialism, is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Mississaugas of the Credit River, and the nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. The territory consists of ceded land covered under Treaty 13, as well as unceded land that continues to be contested. It is the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement between the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes. The Dish with One Spoon agreement recognizes that we live off the same resources, hence protocols are put in place to ensure mutual respect and accountability to each other and to the land. Today, the meeting place of Toronto, or Takaranto, is still the home to Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. Our intersecting communities are comprised of those native to this land, Indigenous people from other territories, as well as settlers who have come here by choice, force, or otherwise a result of colonialism and imperialism. We are all treaty peoples, and thus we are all responsible for honoring and upholding the agreements of this land. We might also want to take this moment to think about other settler colonial projects, other occupied territories and peoples across the globe, and hold space for all the ongoing struggles against colonization, against the usurpation of land, and against the settler colonial violences we stand witness to in many places, including Palestine, Lebanon, and elsewhere. This year's symposium was inspired by the poet Billy Ray Belcourt, who joined us for this event last year, and I know many of you were here for that. He was talking about his own experience reading things he loved and that moved him, including the work of Jose Munoz, and he said, "Sometimes a beautiful sentence can be a reason to live." I was so moved by that possibility and its core belief in the transformative power of words and of art that we decided to dedicate this year's theme to it and assembled a panel of poets and scholar poets to read their work and offer reflections on its significance to them for queer, trans, Black, brown, and Indigenous life worlds. Along the way, as we've been talking about this, we had some really fantastic conversations about the question of beauty, especially given how wrapped up notions of the beautiful are in Western, heteronormative, highly gendered, highly racialized conceptions and norms. What about when survival is ugly? What about other strategies or tools for being and staying in relation, for living and staying alive? I'm not sure what the answer to these questions are, but I believe that things like poetry help to imagine and even to bring into being worlds that do not yet exist, but that we very much want and need. And so I am so very grateful that I have the privilege of introducing our guest speakers today, and I'm going to do so in the order that they will speak. Jaya Jacobo is Assistant Professor of Women and Development Studies at the University of the Philippines in Diliman. She has worked alongside travesti and transsexual women artists, academics, and community workers in Brazil, as well as with trans, queer, and non-binary Filipina XO performers from the Philippines and Filipina diaspora abroad. Jacobo was a former board member of the Society for Trans Women of the Philippines, a former president of the film desk of the Young Critics Circle of the Philippines, a founding co-editor of Queer South Asia, a transgressive journal of literary art, co-editor of BKL, Bikal Bakla, anthology of Bicolanon gay trans queer writing, as well as the forthcoming ASAG anthology of Filipina trans feminine writing. She just released Arasahas, her debut volume of poetry. Did I pronounce that correctly? Good enough. Cameron Awkward Rich is Associate Professor of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at UMass Amherst. He's the author of The Terrible We, Thinking with Trans Maladjustment, which was the finalist for a Lambda Literary Award in Transgender Nonfiction and received a Duke University Press Scholars of Color First Book Award, and of two collections of poetry, Sympathetic Little Monster and Dispatch, which received the press's Lexi Rudninsky Editor's Choice Award. His creative writing has appeared in Poetry, American Poetry Review, African American Poetry, 250 Years of Struggle and Song, a Library of American Anthology, the Kenyon Review, and elsewhere, and has been supported by fellowships from Cave Canem, the Watering Hole, and the Lannan Foundation. Mejdulene Shomali is a queer Palestinian poet and associate professor in women's, gender, and sexuality studies at Williams College. She received a master's in women's studies from the Ohio State University and a PhD in American culture from the University of Michigan. Her research and creative writing occur at the intersection of transnational feminist thought, queer of color critique, and Arab and diasporic Arab cultural production. Mejdulene was a fellow in the Institute of Citizens and Scholars at the Cornell Society for the Humanities. She's the author of Between Banat, Queer Arab Critique in Transnational Arab Archives, which won the 2024 Association for Middle East Women's Studies Book Award honorable mention. She is also the author of the poetry chapbook Agriculture of Grief, Prayers for My Father's Dementia. Her current research concerns affect and embodiment in Palestinian resistance. And our final speaker for this evening will be Danez Smith, who is a poet, writer, and performer from St. Paul, Minnesota. They are the author of the poetry collections Insert Boy, Don't Call Us Dead, Homie, and most recently, Bluff. They have won the Forward Prize for Best Collection, the Minnesota Book Award in Poetry, the Lambda Literary Award for Gay Poetry, the Kate Tufts Discovery Award, and have been a finalist for the NAACP Image Award in Poetry, the National Book Critics Circle Award, and the National Book Award. Their poetry and prose has been featured in Vanity Fair, The New York Times, The New Yorker, GQ, Best American Poetry, and on The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. They are a member of the Dark Noise Collective and the recipient of multiple fellowships, including the National Endowment for the Arts. Please join me in wholeheartedly welcoming these amazing guests.
All right, so good afternoon, dear friends. Thank you for this invitation. I'm delighted to share with you my thoughts on the poetics of transness, or trans as theory and practice of creation, of making, in poetry and in life, in the world at large. I'd like to approach this idea of trans poetics, the concept of transgender creation or creativity of poesis itself, from a reading of the public that is summoned in a discourse entered by the poet herself. I'm speaking of publication, and of course, transing it. The word publish is from the mid-14th century, publition, to make public. Further from publicain, early 14th century, derived from Old French publier, to make public, from the Latin publicare, to make public, from publicus, pertaining to the people. The meaning associated with the book in the market is a late 14th century sense, which coincides with putting one to shame. If publicus referred to the people, it also meant reproducing them, hence breeding was also associated with publishing, especially in the late 14th century. Around the same time, books were also distributed to reading public. As publicus referred to the people in general, it also included senses of ordinariness as well as vulgarity, as in the notion of a public woman in the late 16th century, as a term for a prostitute, a woman open to the use of all. This notion of availability coincides with pubes, the adult, in particular, a full-grown man, as well as pubis, the groin, the genital at the center of the body, the hair that grows around it. Both are related to pubescentia, a ripening. So, to publish along these lines involves an announcement, an availability. Adulthood is signified by a part of the skeleton, housing an organ supposed to enable reproduction, and an outgrowth on that part of the skin to protect that organ that makes possible human begetting. But also, one is presented with the idea of protecting virility as that which makes possible human proliferation, or if you will, publication, vis-a-vis the conversion of a woman's body as an object of exchange with the purpose of sheer sexual pleasure, the publication of her erotic power without any purview of an exclusive relation, as in marriage, and thus outside the expectations generated by the tellus of sexual reproduction. Now, if a trans woman is a person crossing over not only from gender to gender, but also from sex to sex, that is a trans woman published within the medical transcript and on the surgical table, or not if she is constituted pornographically as a differently female prostituted commodity. How in the world can a trans woman, for example, imagine herself publishing outside of these realms? And before anything else, to write herself out of these circles, of the carcerals into the world, as an author of her own destiny, transcribing her right to a life, to a possibility. In Filipino, the word for publish is limbag. Pedro de San Buenaventura's Vocabulario de Lengua Tagalog, 1613, mentions limbagan, to publish something onto something, and translates the word into fundir, to melt and molde, to shape. Within the Spanish post-colony, that also constituted the prostituta, or mujer publica, or mujer indocumentada, a woman without a certificate of residence, a divergent notion of publication was being presented away from the human, the relations they form, and the assemblages they amass. What is offered is a model of malleability, premised on a process more intimate, to metal, something more of the earth. And this is where I derive a project of writing and a program of putting out the writing out there alongside just the transmutations that trans bodies allow themselves to go through. Something is published from shifting from one form to another, but only after a meticulous procedure that subjects an ore to turn to gold, for example. At Asajas, my debut book of poetry was published by the independent press Savage Mind Publishing House in the Philippines in 2023, the second edition in 2024, and the translation by Christian Jill Benitez was published by PAWA and Paloma Presses in San Francisco last year. Allow me to say that I have been writing and publishing since 2000, the year 2000, and began and writing poetry since 1999, but because of a cis-het Philippine publishing tradition that began in 1593, when the Catechism Doctrina Christiana was printed, the first book-length volume of trans poetry in the post-colonial national language was only published after 430 years in 2023 under my name as poet. And this year, a couple more trans feminine poets are publishing their own debuts, and we are co-editing the first anthology of writing by trans women to be published by Gantala, a feminist press based in Manila. It must also be said that while there had been innumerable trans women writers, artists and creatives in Mara Archipelago, even before the Spaniards came, the structures and systems of the country prior to, during, and after empire subjected these women to various forms of duress. These women could only focus their energy on making sense of their suffering and transforming the grievance into trans-feminine solidarity. I divided my debut of book, Arasas, into it's 40 poems, 4 parts, 10 poems for each part. According to the line of a Tagalog Tinaga, an indigenous poetic form published in Juan de Nuceda and Pedro de Sanlucar's Vocabulario de Lengua Tagala of 1860. And I quote the poetic form. It's 4 lines with perfect rhyme and 7 lines, 7 syllables each line. And the rhyme is on the vowel. Ang ligaya ko ngani, gintong walang balaki, bakit mabuting uri dawaraway pili? That's Old Tagalog. Christian Benitez, a poet himself, translates, this, my happiness, a gold so pure. Oh, how come the good is filigree, a crook? This poem from the ancient Tagalog speaks of limbagan, publication through the poetics of gold, the melting and the shaping of earth, and embeds in the act of making the sentiment of joy, which is paradoxically configured as only possibly pure in designs of seeming fragmentation and brokenness. To publish then within a poetics of tropicality in the post-colony is to configure shapes not out of nothing, but from what has always been there, break them down and transfigure the possible, even if they remain unwhole. And here, I'm also intimating that cusp that translation nominates as an interstice of poetic possibility within that resistance to the whole. Let me end the speech with passages from 2 poems dramatizing the dignity of re-existence that dwells within that refusal. I will read them first in Filipino and then in English as translated by Christian Joel Benitez, my queer co-creator. In Sacerdotisa, the priestess works through an emotion, love in particular. Sa bawat buwang bagot bilog, hinahasa niya yaring pandamdam. Niyahandog ang puso bilang lagusan ng kung anong pag-ibig di matatalos ni numan. On each moon, full and new, she refines her senses, offering her heart as passage for whatever love no one shall understand. The feminine of the divine ruminates on her solitude, purifies eros, and allows herself to be a vessel, even of passion's passage into clarity through the spells of the ambiguous, electing herself to ascesis and shunning publicus in favor of the sanctum of the self. In the splendor of its secrets, she remains inviolate. And yet, because of the purity of her rumination, her intellect supersedes the way of the negative. She affirms herself in solitariness. Sa paglipas ng kahuli-hulihang pusyaw ng karimlan, doon niya lamang tunay na naunawaan, ang lumbay na iyo'y walang bahid ng gaba, ang lumbay, lumbay lamang. And there, as the last hue of the dark fades, only truly she understands, the sorrow you have is no retribution divine. Sorrow is only as sorrow must. This embodiment of insurgency from within the transfeminine solitude is in conversation with my reading of Elizabeth Bovinelli's mediation of Foucault's distinctions between the population and the people, and finally the person within biopower. For Bovinelli, and I quote, the transition from being a residual within the population to an instance of the people depends on a sort of person who is capable of hearing, feeling addressed by, and acting on the command to exit this position and to actively differ. But a person who can exit her inertia is not generated from within, but is produced and capacitated in a loop from the outside, in and inside to out, end of quote. In Beata, the feminine embraces publicus on the condition of belonging to a solidarity of the divine feminine. A young woman yearns to enter the convent. Tinawag siya ng isang tinig, dahil lamang sa paglayas, karayom at gunting. Kailangan mo ng talim sa harap nilang walang naririnig kundi alingaw sa katedral na di dinadalaw ng mga nananalig. Nang tumapak sa kumbento, hindi siya pinatuloy. Ika-isang India, iha. Naisip ko mang ika'y tanggapin, ako'y mapapahamak. Malinaw ito, Doña Hieronima. Tumugon ang dalaga. Pahingi na lamang po ng tela at sinulid. Para saan? May darating pang ibang dalaga. Ipagtatahi ko sila. She was called by a voice, run away, bring a needle, and a pair of scissors. You will need sharpness before them who hear nothing but echoes of cathedrals, empty of believers. Arriving at the convent, she was never open doors. You are in India, iha. Even if I wanted to take you, I'll be putting myself in trouble. I understand, Doña Hieronima, the young girl answered. Can you give me instead a piece of fabric, a thread? What for? I shall sew for them, the other coming girls. In the name of my trans women sisters and the other coming girls, I shall fashion myself from iron to gold, from sorrow to love, from thread to thread, from filigree to filigree. I am the alchemy of other women whose bones and spirits have been broken. It is from their dust that I emerge with public vengeance. Thank you so much. Maraming salamat.
Hi, everybody. I think that I made the decision to be here as the poet, Cameron Awkward-Rich, instead of the scholar, Cameron Awkward-Rich, which means I don't have any thoughts, just feelings. So the main thing that I'm going to be sharing tonight is a sort of poem essay thing that I wrote 2 years ago, and it keeps on being the only thing that I want to read. It's loosely an epistolary sequence directed at the 20th century poet, priest, lawyer, etc., Polly Murray, who I fell into a kind of like an obsession about in 2020. You know, I turned 30 and started looking around for dads. The epistolary sequence is a palinode, meaning that it is a retraction of a former piece of writing. And in this case, it was a sort of preemptive retraction of an essay that came out after I had started reading this poem around. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a bit, like an abbreviated bit of the essay, mostly the part that will give you some context about Polly Murray, and also where I will say what the essay will do, but then instead of doing it, I'm going to rather abruptly change genre. And I hope that in all of this, you will be able to discern some thinking about trans poetics, trans ways of making sense and making sentences and making life, though I also hope that I'm not making any particular argument about what those ways are. So, okay. The essay was called Looking for Polly Murray's Trans Poetics. Actually, I'm going to bring this up here so that I don't have to do this sort of awkward maneuver, and hope that it stays. Cool. And first I'll read from a bit of the essay, which was called The Killing Weight of Time. And over this hovers an epigraph by Lauren Berlant. The impasse is a space of time lived without a narrative genre. For Polly Murray, poetry was what one did in an impasse, in the midst of a situation in which no forward-moving action was possible. I'm inclined to think, Murray related in a 1976 interview, that when I could effectively act, I did not write. When I could not act, when I was blocked from acting, it came out in words. Although for Murray, writing was not the same as action, it was an outcome of the same force that they called their fire, their unrest, or simply their response to situations, that also drove them to legible forms of political action. For Murray, then, poetry and writing more generally was the only thing that eased the pressure that builds in situations of obstructed agency. By acting as an outlet for their restless unrest and a repository of unresolvable conflict and deferred desire, poetry was one practice that enabled Murray to endure, in their very evocative phrasing, the killing weight of time. As it presently circulates in the United States, trans, I think, is often tethered to an unbearable optimism that makes it difficult to account for the forms, effects, and endemicity of living in deferral, or as the philosopher Gil Malatino puts it, in interregnum, in the crucial and transformative moments between past and future, between the regime of what was and the promise of what might be. This is to say that the object trans is invested with optimism in Berlant's sense of the term. It's an object that seems to promise that nearness to it, and I think it's important to stress that nearness can be a relation of loving embrace or of violence, that nearness to it will help you or the world become different in just the right way. In particular, the thing that trans in this time and place seems to promise is the resolution of what we might call conflicts of sex-gender on multiple scales, both for better and for worse. And it's precisely the suturing of transness to futurity, to the promise or threat of becoming different, that makes deferral such a common and effective mechanism of trans antagonism. Indeed, to live a trans life in this time and place is often to find oneself dispossessed of the power to give sense in both senses to one's life, to state the meaning and direction of one's existence, to be condemned to live in a time oriented by others, to have one's social reality thrown into question and by that mechanism deferred. Pauli Murray, speaking of futurity, is one of those figures who is sort of persistently narrated as, in every aspect of their life, having always arrived just a bit too soon. Born in 1910, Pauli Murray was at turns a civil rights activist, a labor organizer, a lawyer, a poet, a memoirist, a professor, a priest. As one profile put it, at times it almost seemed as though there had been several Pauli Murrays, each of whom excelled at what she did. Murray's untimeliness can be perceived in even an abbreviated list of their exploits and accomplishments. And just as one tiny example, there was a time in 1944 when they wrote a kind of a final paper for law school at Howard University, and everyone was like, this thing that you're proposing, that is bullshit, that doesn't make any sense. But then a decade later, it was used by the NAACP legal team in the Brown v. Board arguments. Their list of early arrivals to the scene proliferated for decades and ended with Murray's national recognition as the first Black woman to be ordained as an Episcopal priest in 1977, 8 years before their death. And yet, Murray's untimeliness is not only an effect of retrospection, insofar as they appear in situations always just prior to events that have been subsequently narrated as history. Untimeliness also marked Murray's sense of their own life. They are quoted in interviews and profiles variously describing their life as being on the edge of time. Quote, "It may be that I telescoped history, projecting my vision into the future." Quote, "I was 21 years ahead of myself. All I've done my entire life is forecast my future." Quote, "I'm always ahead of my time." Living presently in the contingent future was, it seems, at turns exhilarating and lonely, full of delayed gratification and maddening blocks to action. Particularly maddening for Murray were their untimely attempts to be treated with testosterone for what they deemed variously their inverted sex instinct, desire to be male, conflict with regard to sex, and so on. Indeed, from about the late 1930s to the early 1950s, Murray was one of among many Americans who read stories about endocrinological manipulations of sex that circulated in the press and subsequently attempted to find doctors who would render similar treatments. Eventually, after being blocked at every turn, Murray gave up their quest to experiment on the male side, as they put it. It is not, that is, controversial to speculate that Murray, had they not been 21 years ahead of themselves, might have lived a transsexual life. As it was, they lived a trans life, one that was often shaped by intense conflicts with regard to sex, both intimate and socio-political, which multiple times led to emotional breakdowns, hospitalizations, career derailments, frustrated desires, blocked efforts, and eventually led Murray to the political activity of feminism. In any case, while it's not controversial to think about Murray in relation to trans, there has been no agreement about pronoun use. All of Murray's biographers have preferred she, but recently the historian Naomi Simmons-Thorne has argued for the use of he and him in reference, not to make claims to Murray's true essential gender identity, but to interrupt the logic of biological determinism and the constraints of cis-sexism operating historically. You'll notice that I've chosen to use they in reference to Murray, but not to adjudicate their gender or strip them of their historical context. Like Simmons-Thorne, and given that I am a poet, not a historian, I've used this bit of language as a small insistence on what exceeds constraint. Thinking with Murray's poetry will lead me back to pronouns, and similarly, rather than providing a means of gendered closure, I'll offer the pronomial as one set of strategies that Murray employed for living within the impasse without resolution. 2, palinode. Hovering over this, there are 2 epigraphs. The proximities of the archive disperse the feeling of otherwise being consumed by the present and its many emergencies, Jules Gill Peterson. Reading only with and for transsexuals, I read for my life. J. Prosser. Dear Polly, I've been trying to write about you for some years now and cannot, have not been able. Well, other people might say I have been. I've given talks. There's an essay under contract, but I haven't been able yet to say what I mean. Lately, each thing I do is the form of the epistolary, apostrophe, some particular impossible you. The problem is, of course, one of audience, address. I cannot have a single thought. From what I can tell, you didn't have that problem. You were, I think, able to hold something like a nation in your head. Still, it must have eventually driven you mad from scene to scene, institution to institution, looking for felicitous language, the precise vocabulary, syntax for making clear what to you was always clear, that you were alive. Anyway, I've been having trouble lately. The sentences either do not come or lie flat or say only what is obvious to say. Life hangs beneath a question. Dear Polly, am I right to say that for you, the poet was at best a kind of prophet? Not a fortune teller, but in the biblical tradition, someone who could sense the future looming in the present, who issues the warning, if we do not change our course, we will be and thus are already doomed. Dear Polly, in interviews, you say that writing was what enabled you to bear your life beneath the question. Is what you did, that is, when no other action was possible, a little valve for when the pressure built. Anger otherwise would kill you. When asked at 67, at the edge of your fourth, fifth career, if you would ever let yourself rest, you said, in short, I'd be dead if I did. In the essay, the one under contract, the one I am already ashamed of, I make arguments, or try to. First, I argue that you understood yourself as living somehow in the future. Ahead of myself is how you put it once, 21 years ahead. Second, I argue that this is a trans way of occupying time, living out the future in the present tense, embodying for others, for yourself, Ernst Bloch's not yet. It's easy to idealize, being imbued with the sheen of futurity, endless becoming, longing that propels us, etc. But it's terrible, you know. Or it is also terrible. People take up all kinds of postures toward the future. Hope is one. Dread, militarized fear. I write, if all goes well, to find out what I do not know. Dear Polly, before the war, you had been in love. Not just, that is, experiencing the feeling of love, but held inside of it. Held and then no longer held because love could not see you as you were, a man you tried for over a decade to become. Sex was a scene of your impossibility. People interpret this in all kinds of ways. False consciousness, schizophrenia, ego-dystonic lesbianism, transsexuality, the disease of reading, and sure, me too. In a prior scene, I am 13. I've just finished a novel, Middlesex. I'm crouching on the blue carpet in my blue room. I'm trying to sense how I might too have secreted inside the capacity to change. Dear Polly, about you, it was once reported that your errands were carefully planned so that you could travel in a circle, not wasting time. In the essay, I argue that although by the late 1960s or so, you had fallen out of the future, taken up residence in the past-present tense, come to feel history more and more as a series of closed loops, we can sense, nonetheless, in your poems, your photographs, your strained sentences, your trans life preserved in the aesthetic, your still latent futures given form. Dear Polly, in 2011, in California, I rode my bicycle for miles to the office of a doctor whose name I do not any longer know. He gave me what you, nearly a century ago, had wanted with a kind of fervor I can never muster. I'm not saying it was easy. There had been psychologists and letters and prior attempts and protracted conflict and years and furtive transit and paperwork and endless deadening talk, but it was possible. Dear Polly, I encounter a thought that breaks a little more my heart. You say, finally, that race and sex are biologically permanent. You grow from a child to an adult, an alien may become a citizen, and so on, but where you have a permanent characteristic, it is on the basis of one's birth that one becomes a member of that caste. It is completely imposed upon one, and there is no way that one can escape. I don't know when this thought, the finality of it, seized you. Was it your admiration of Mary Daly, her writing, her beautiful tan? Was it that you could no longer bear hope's disappointment? Was it that you were, in some important way, already dead? All I know is that by the end of your life, having discovered no other way, you had become convinced that race, that sex were closed forms. Polly, listen. They aren't. It isn't. Dear Polly, if you were alive now, I suspect I wouldn't so admire you. National organization, lawyer, priest, National Organization of Women acquainted with the president's wife. But because you are dead, I do. Of course, if you were alive now, you wouldn't be in every important way you. I spend my whole life trying to convince my students of this. Our categories have histories, I say, gesturing wildly with my little nub of chalk. There, at work, I use words like contingency, discursive formations, rupture, and yet, today, walking with F through our Massachusetts town, I insist, as always, on a circular route. Coffee, then groceries, then flowers, for its tender efficiency. Oh, Polly, how can I help it? The first, the beautiful thought. You. Dear Polly, I have been wasting time. Doom is, among other things, why I'm here, trying to speak to you. Dear Polly, I guess the truth is that I am not brave, do not want to be brave. I want my classes, my students, my domestic poems. I want to move in small circles. I want 20 minutes in the morning, the blue couch, my blue room. Dear Polly, across the country, across the Senates and House chambers and governors' desks and Twitter feeds and liberal papers, someday is busy legislating sex, race, the people, the human, etc. as closed forms. They are busy, that is, making life always impossible in the name of life. I can offer endless, impersonal explanations, but I feel at first as numb hand, clenched thought, bird in the throat. What was it you said? Race is the atmosphere we breathe from day to day, the pervasive irritant, the chronic allergy, the vague apprehension that makes one uncomfortable, jumpy. Dear Polly, even now, I can't say what I mean. Dear Polly, I am writing to you because I cannot write. Everywhere there is language, enumerations of the problem, diagnoses the problem beginning as far back as I can imagine, farther still. In class, I pace with my chalk. I circle the room, the words, e.g. neoliberalism, biopolitics, coloniality, modernity, the nuclear family foreign, and so on, draw desperate, crooked lines. I say and say and say, and what for? Increasingly, I think there's only one word that might matter. No. Dear Polly, the more I look at you, the more I am overcome with an eerie feeling, a visceral near identification that seems against my better judgment that it might rescue me. I have become frankly fixated on this image of you who were prolific amidst Jim Crow, the fascist American mid-century, the Great Depression, your endless dislocation in pursuit of meaningful work, the atmosphere of anti-blackness, the deathly race-gender politics of the university, your loneliness, your unruly mind, the thwarting of your trans desires during a tipping point when sex change was heralded as newly possible, fixated on the question simply of how you thought under these conditions, how you endured the present tense. Dear Polly, no. No, 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 no. Dear Polly, I am standing before a crowd of people I admire, talking incoherently about you, my pursuit of you. What everyone will remember is that I am lonely, or that I have formal questions about loneliness, about whether it is a feeling that produces continuity, a desire for continuity where there might more ethically be rupture. All day, they come up to me to report that they like what I said about loneliness, which makes me suspicious. Am I lonely? Am I lonely? My days are crowded with other people. Dear Polly, I look for as long as I can stand at one particular image. You as young man, you as Pete, you as self-proclaimed vagabond in a leather coat. I go tender for this image. You are young, little brother, so young. This is before Bellevue and the rest home, before the arrest and the intake forms and your desperate lines, before you spread beneath the knife in search of hidden organs, before the first end of love, before you are refused and refused and refused and made, I can't help but think, into the bravest thing, black girl, black woman. Dear Polly, as far as I know, there is no tense, not in English, to describe the shape of time you help me see. The was will be, the salted circle, the still not yet. Dear Polly, your name for her, your first great love, was Pan, Pete and Pan, the boy who would not grow up, the boy who returns and returns to the same house, the same window, though nothing ever is the same. Polly, the truth is, after all this time, I want him simply to have lived. I think this means, shamefully, inconceivably, I want to live, to have lived. And though no word was uttered above the tumult of advancing tide, you came uncalled and placed your hand in mine. Thank you.
Hello. So I'm just going to start with some gratitude. I'm going to thank Dana for inviting us, to Keith for arranging everything and responding to my increasingly neurotic email, and to everyone with the Bonham Centre for showing us such a warm welcome. I want to thank my co-panelists as well. I feel really humbled to be in this group. I also want to echo the gratitude to be on this land, which I am not an original steward of, but I am grateful to be held here. To start, I want to take a few moments to call Palestine into the room. Though a ceasefire in Gaza went into effect on January 19th, Palestinians in both the West Bank and Gaza continue to suffer under the Zionist entity. Israel has repeatedly violated the terms of the ceasefire, holding up aid, denying the entry of life-saving equipment, and murdering over 100 people. Meanwhile, in the West Bank, the entity has escalated its aggression with attacks on Jenin, Nablus, and Tulkarm, with mass displacements, with the construction of and closure of numerous checkpoints between West Bank towns, with unchecked state settler violence, with mass arrests, with assaults on local infrastructures, and again, the killing of dozens of Palestinians, many children and minors. For Palestinians, there is no ceasefire, no end to genocide. For Palestine, liberation can only come with the end of the occupation. So I will say glory to our martyrs and power to Palestinian resistance. Thanks. I urge you to join the movement to liberate Palestine, and there are so many ways to do so, including educating and countering media bias, putting pressure on your local representatives, participating in and organizing direct actions, practicing and lobbying for BDS, and financially supporting Palestinians on the ground in Gaza and the West Bank. If you have not yet engaged with this movement, I would ask you to consider your own relationship to genocide, because I assure you our lives are deeply intertwined. None of us will be free until all of us are free. So may we all remain steadfast in our efforts, and may our collective resistance witness a free Palestine in our lifetime. Thank you. As I prepared for this event, I reflected on the idea shared with us by the organizers that a beautiful sentence could save a life. But against the backdrop of the extreme violence which characterizes the occupation, the extreme and ontological violence with which the US settler colony attempts to erase queer and trans people, we might wonder, what is the function of poetry, and what can we ask of beauty? I am a Libra who loves beauty. I do. Ahead of the acceleration of the genocide in October, I was starting a project on the role of pleasure and beauty in Palestinian resistance, or their role as resistance. I've hesitated to pursue this project, anxious that it disrespected the suffering visited upon Palestine in the months since. So frequently, the beauty we see in Palestinians is used to argue against the attacks on our humanity or to otherwise defend it. How can you look at men digging through the rubble with their bare hands to find their neighbors and see anything but their beauty? But another question, why ought we need to? Does this lionization of our people's care for one another and steadfastness also tell us something ugly? Do we expect from Palestine either its exceptional beauty or its egregious suffering? Do we expect Palestinian beauty to save our souls, restore our humanity by consuming theirs? So I've struggled with this question about beauty, about what it makes possible and what it obscures. I have found solace in beauty and been repulsed by its proliferation and display. We ask too much of beauty, and we ask too little of one another. In his account of the 1936 to 1939 revolution in Palestine, Ghassan Kanafani wrote that poets and musicians used their craft to reflect the hopes and concerns of the Palestinian farmers whose livelihoods were decimated by the early Zionist movement, a destruction which then eased the way of the formation of the settler state in 1948. Kanafani, a socialist artist and prominent member of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, traced the cultural and historical significance of Palestinian poetry and argued that it was in a dialectic and thereby iterative relationship with materialist struggle. Poetry kept pace with the people, and it mobilized them. Poetry grew political consciousness, and it incited action. Kanafani, like many Palestinians before and since, was assassinated precisely in response to the revolutionary thinking and commitment his work inspired. In December 2023, Palestinian poet Rifat al-Arir was targeted and assassinated in his home in Gaza for the same kind of reason. While it is reasonable to be measured in our estimation of poetry's efficacy, these histories urge us to take seriously poetry's power. We cannot write the poem to end any war. But for Kanafani, we could write the one that ignites resistance, that builds connections, that tells a yet unrecorded story. This impetus guides my work across genre, evident in research on queer Arab women and queer Arab resistance, as well as in poetry and creative writing. As a Palestinian diaspora, I must further ask what role I have in the liberation of my community and what ways I perpetuate US settler violence. Mahmoud Darwish frequently narrated Palestine through the experience of exile and the means by which memory then becomes the nation itself, becomes the homeland. Though my work is not comparable, I write in the traditions of exile with the commitment to witness. The Arabic word for witness shares its root with the root word for martyr. Both are iterations of shahd, alternately translated as to witness, to attest, to testify. A martyr is one who has witnessed. Though much is lost in translation, the work of witness is the work of life and death. In the face of genocide, Zionist repression, and historical erasure, Palestinian poetics are the work of grief, memory, and world-making. What world we make is both ancestral and future-facing. In my work, I have attempted to navigate the space between beauty as humanizing and poetry as record. I've looked to queerness to think through the project of futurity. I've looked to queerness, particularly as it was practiced in Arab communities, to understand how we make something visible but not legible, seen but not known. I've taken up translation and transliteration as methods of refusal and transparency. I have considered what ought to be recorded and for whom. And I have returned always to Palestine as a material reality that can and must be addressed beyond the rhetorical and discursive. I think that is why the land features so prominently in my work, and why I can no longer speak of Palestine without speaking of it as a future that we refuse to yield, a present that we cannot abandon, and a past we must preserve. So I'm going to pivot here and share some poems. I appear as half scholar, half poet today. Hopefully some of the poems speak to the themes in the earlier comments. The first poem is called Stone Heart, and it has an epigraph by Lucille Clifton from her poem Mulberry Fields, and that epigraph reads, I say the stones marked an old tongue, and it was called eternity. Stone Heart. In Palestine, a stone is a poem held in two palms like communion or prayer. In Palestine, a stone breaks open to reveal an almond still soft. In Palestine, a stone marks the edge of the field where we should not trample. In Palestine, a stone is the marker of life after it is over. In Palestine, my first boyfriend carved my name into a stone. He wrote my name in English wrong. I wore the stone around my neck. I met him leaning against a car parked outside a church. In Palestine, teenagers cruise each other outside churches, outside delis, outside mosques. In Palestine, I get cruised outside a church, a deli, a mosque, at school in Jerusalem before I am too old to be allowed into Jerusalem. I get cruised on a bus, in a cab, at the gates of the old city. In Palestine, I get cruised at a checkpoint. The guard is a teenage boy. He carries a rifle. It is slung over his shoulder. I carry a backpack. It is slung over my shoulder. He says, if you smile, I will let you through. I am 11 at the time, but I am told my chest makes me look older. He says, if you smile, I will let you through. I am 11 at the time. I say, my smile is made of stones. I say, my style launches stones like a slingshot. I say, the sky is raining with stones like birds. The checkpoints and walls and containers are exploding, and the stones dropping drum eternity. The sky is raining with stones like birds. In Palestine, a stone is the marker of life after it is over. A stone is a poem, a communion, a prayer. A stone marks the field where we should not trample. In Palestine, a stone breaks open. It grows, it blossoms. In Palestine, a bird soars overhead. You don't, that's okay. Not surprisingly, I think I found it really hard to write in the past year and a half. And this is probably one of the only things that I was able to write in the past year and a half. So it's called Meditations on Safety. It is 2023 and you are screaming into the pillows while bombs drop at home. There is no metaphor here. Two bodies apart, two worlds. You cannot touch them, cannot reach beyond the grip of grief, and you cannot make it stop. You cannot make it stop. It is 1993 and you go home. You remember watching CNN with Baba, asking him why the Palestinians were so dirty. You leave America soon after. You are supposed to stay. Bet Sahur is quiet. You barely remember the checkpoints, the curfew, the searches, the border, the thick throat. Instead, you remember the boy, the best friend, the teacher's ruler burning your palms when slap, slap. You cannot come to the answer you spent all night memorizing. You were safe then, all things considered. It is 1997 and you do not recognize yourself in America. You become shy again. You hide your body, bigger and more fragile and more. You hide so well, you cannot remember where you left you. At school, a white boy asks, "Did you have cars? Did you ride donkeys?" True story. You do not remember the answer. Were you safe then? A military recruiter comes to the high school. You ask Baba if you should join and get college for free. He says, "What will you do when they send you to kill our people?" You live at home. Pell Grants and loans and 2 jobs and Baba's endless back-breaking labor. It is 2003 and you're in college when a white boy in class calls you a dirty Palestinian. Point blank, he says it over and over. No one stops him. You do not stop him. You are on a delayed timer. You do not feel things when they happen. You have an answering machine brain. It will give you the message later. Your heart goes off at random intervals, a light in the house to convince robbers that someone is home. Rewind the tape. Please, play it again. What did he say to you, Baba? It is 2013 and it's a wash. You host people in your home, and in 10 years, they will stand by idle while your community gets slaughtered. You didn't know it then, but you were the same dirty Palestinian from CNN, from high school, from college, from Gaza, from Hamas, from terrorists, from terror, from God, my God, my God. They bombed a hospital and the bodies are gray with soot. You are safe now, you think. Away from the bombs, the guns, the brutal. You culled your friend list to its core. Okay, yes, 3 boys shot in Vermont. Okay, yes, that colleague that wants to see you fired. Okay, yes, they are doxing and arresting and prosecuting, and the dirt they have, the dirt isn't even dirt, but watch, they will bury you with it. Okay, thanks. Again, we don't have to do it. I'm just pausing so I can, catch my breath and shit. You don't have to. Yeah. I think of this as my gayest poem, and I thought, oh, queer and trans poetics, let's go. So, yeah. I don't know, can you quantify your gayest poem? Let's talk about it in the Q&A. My mother says this would have never happened if we stayed in Palestine. 1, imagine I am 24 getting married to Rami or Fadi or even Musa. Imagine I wear the big white dress. Imagine I am 28 with 2 children. Imagine I am searching but not finding. Maybe I am 18 going to college in Ramallah. I meet Rima and Rauda and Huda. We drink Taiba beer in the gardens. We smoke apple argilas and dance into the morning. Or I am 32, married and infertile. I translate Arabic to English for American tourists. I name things unspeakable. I draw down the blinds of myself. 2, I guess we'll never know, I say, and the scene freezes. Lawrence Fishburne as Edward Said emerges from the pantry. The Orient becomes a living tableau of queerness, he says. Take the red pill and I'll show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. I take the red pill on a plane with Layla Khaled. We have facial reconstructions once a week. Today I am Kulthum and she is Abdel Nasser. We land the plane in the lap of the Sphinx. Darwish and Kanafani are still alive while Fairuz sings Al-Bosta. 3, Luti, Ma'boon, Mukhannith, Suhaqiyya, Mutadakira, Hassan Sabi, Naqis, Shadda, Mutahawilin. 4, Love, lace your thighs in mine. Together we are weaving a time warp, another dimension where I will always find you. I had a lot of trouble picking pieces for this event. I don't know why. But yesterday at the workshop, I remembered this poem, and I thought that it would be a fitting way to close my time with you. It's called Vernacular as Ethnographic Refusal, and it's after Marwa Hilal, Egyptian-American poet. My siblings and I make a game of it, translating Arabic to English, intimating the uncanny. We are literal above metaphor. Who would pee on a dying man's hand? Why would the pee save him? Arabs in America, we have no context. 4 daughters pray to the Virgin Mary. Every 2 hours, another spoonful. Meat, chicken, eggs, and still no good at school. Imagine bringing makluba to a 5th grade potluck, like leaning against a slanted wall. We die into each other, this secret language, this great-grandfather's legacy, this house of poets. We are a shit sword falling to the ground. We are circling on the loose strands of our hair. We are breathing incense. We are leaving and never returning. May God arrive you there in peace. May you find what you left as you left it. May God leave you for one another. Thank you.
That was beautiful, Dr. Shomali. And also, I think we wrote very twin essays. And so I think I'm gonna skip through some of my talk just to get to a little bit more poems, because I was just gonna say what you said in Black, I think. Which just maybe just speaks to our deep solidarity between our peoples, and our tied, and our tied journeys to freedom, our need for one another, and my love and appreciation for your work and for your genius. And for all my co-panelists, can we give it up for all of them one more time? Yes. Yeah, I feel a deep gratitude to be on this panel as the lone non-scholar. But just y'all's brilliant minds and poetry. I'm like shaky and teary. I wish I was just out there and didn't have to do this right now. To just really appreciate. But I can't wait for our talk in a second. Yeah, I just so much about to y'all. Thank you to everybody who had a part in helping us be here today. Thank y'all so much. What am I gonna do? I'm not gonna read half of what the fuck I wrote. What does it amount to? If I had it longer, maybe I'll try to write this essay later. I think this would be a larger piece about what is your poetics in the midst of crisis. We might look at the poetics of Essex Hemphill and Tory Dent in the midst of the AIDS epidemic. We might look at what made Leroy Jones turn into Mary Baraka, and also some of the mandates of the Black arts movement. We'll look at a lot of things. This essay veers and talks about June Jordan's I Must Become a Menace to My Enemies at some point. Maybe I'll read that part, but I think I'm just gonna read the beginning and the end, and we'll see where else we get. Or let me time myself, because I run over. Word. How y'all doing, by the way? Y'all good? Yeah. Cool. Unlike the previous panelists, I very much want y'all to clap when I read a poem. Cool. Just so that's understood. Let's begin here with a quote from a poem of mine called Minneapolis, St. Paul. It wasn't poetry when polyester blend knee anviled the lovers golf and bet. We were in the streets next day, no question was proposed by the knee. The wait was an answer. I was there wherever I go when one of us is murdered. My usual shoes, usual rage, my new name, same who. When I looked up, there was smoke, but there had been smoke before, but I could smell it now. Good stink of a burning, finally ours, not the blaze of guns or the devil's tax or his hot stone plantations. No, like fire fire, like the wind cradling the brick. I didn't know brick could burn. I didn't know Wendy's was so flammable. I loved every minute of it. I pissed my skivvy scared. I prayed for this. Then God showed up with it. I wasn't ready. In 2020, after the murder of George Floyd, during the uproar that followed, during the military occupation and curfew, during the resistance and the attempts at revolution, during the aftermath that eventually joined the long shadow of our enslavement and dehumanization that has created and characterized America, beauty was not sufficient. In 2019, after writing my third collection in 5 years, I felt empty of poetry, which was fine. I think periods of silence and being without words are expected and even necessary for those of us who work in language. But after my hometown of Minneapolis became the epicenter of a COVID-19 assisted global resistance movement, I never felt further from poetry in my writing life. The needs of my city, of my people, of our future felt material, immediate, tangible. The beauty and wisdom that poems conjure felt insufficient. The rooms poetry summons us to felt like distractions. The capital and systems of the literary world felt utterly repellent. I didn't have time to be a poet, let alone a professional one. It was time to be a neighbor, a citizen, a warrior, a human. I didn't want poetry. I didn't want beauty. I didn't have use for the lyric when my world felt on fire, was on fire. The poetics I needed wasn't utterable, it was actionable. I wanted change, rage, resolution, revolution, wreckage, reparations, transformation. I wanted the portal to some other arrangement of the world, to some other relationship with power. I couldn't write about 2020 until 2022. The riotous moment in the middle of a quarantine had settled back into something similar to the world before. While I believe that we are still living in the aftermath of that year and yet to arrive at the end of its consequences and transformations, the heat of the moment had become useful coal I could finally make something with. To me, the me who began writing my most recent collection, Bluff, was a poet very disillusioned with poetry. I wanted to break poetry, break the poet I had been, break up with beauty for beauty's sake, break up with art that was interested in how it was received, and write instead art that knew its demands. I didn't want to make art. I wanted to make propaganda. I wanted no mystery in what my spells are trying to summon. Oh shit, I'm gonna read the whole thing, okay. June Jordan's poem, I Must Become a Menace to My Enemies, is one of my favorite poems for many reasons. A few I'll entertain you with today. One, the poem acts as a call to action to the poet herself. She asks in the poem's second section, how many of my brothers and sisters will they kill before I teach myself retaliation? That question hangs over my heart, troubles my hands. How long will I reach for poetry before other tools are required for my mission? How long will writing be my action? How long will I find other things to do? How long will I find other things to do with their violence besides return it to them? I feel you, Miss Jordan. Another reason I love this poem, there's an interruption. The second section of the poem reads in full. How many of my brothers and my sisters will they kill before I teach myself retaliation? Shall we pick a number? South Africa, for instance. Do we agree that more than 10,000 in less than a year, but less than 5,000 slaughtered in more than 6 months will? What is the matter with me? I must become a menace to my enemies. I am grateful for that halting question, for the poet screaming how the poet screams herself from the logics and from doing the mathematics and logics of fighting white supremacist capitalist state-sanctioned violence. What is the matter with me? 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 This question haunts me, rattles me, pushes me out of my comfort and towards who I need to be. I want to hold that question close to me at all times. Let it awaken me again and again into new orientations with my work and mission. The third reason I love this poem, there is still beauty, still love. As Jordan ends the poem, drawing closer to the poem's final declaration of, I must become a menace to my enemies, she also mentions the blossoming flamingos of my wild mimosa trees, which every time catches me off guard. Quote, and if I ever let love go, because the hatred and the whisperings become a phantom dictate I obey in lieu of impulse and realities, the blossoming flamingos of my wild mimosa trees, then let love freeze me out. I must become a menace to my enemies. Again, where the hell do these trees come from? Their sudden pink flash and flaunting beauty in the midst of a poem about the poet edging herself towards a more revolutionary reality. I feel Jordan smacking me in the back of the head, reminding me that yes, revolution, yes, you must transform, but never, ever forget love. Never ever forget that to know your rage because you too know beauty, because the world has endangered those who you find beautiful. Thank you, June. I think, not yet. I think the poem does in its 2 pages what I spent 140-something pages trying to do in my book, Bluff. Before I read some poems from that collection and a couple of new poems, I just want to say that after writing that book and wrestling with what felt like my very reason for continuing to be a poet, I came to this. Beauty is not sufficient. Making poetry and art making in general is not enough reason for me to create. But there is no movement without energy. Shout out to Newton. And one way that I can be useful, one way that I can be a menace to my enemies, one way that I can be a medicine to my people and a portal to our shared future is to make work that is a fuel for the personal and societal revolutions we must go through to get to that better day we deserve and are tasked to engineer. I don't think beautiful sentences save our lives. I think beautiful sentences give us the instructions and energy we require to save ourselves. In the words of a poem from Bluff, this is the ending of a poem called Ars Poetica. Dear reader, whenever you are reading this is the future to me, which means tomorrow is still coming, which means today still lives, which means there is still time for beautiful, urgent change, which means there is still time to make more alive, which means there is still poetry. Now you clap. Cool. All right. Time for a couple of poems. I think in our talk, or in our Q&A, somebody should ask us a question about time. And somebody should ask, I'm just asking you to reflect this back to us. Someone should also ask us a question about lineage and ancestry. And yeah, you formulate the rest of it, but around that area, I would like to talk. Cool. This poem is called Less Hope. Apologies. I was part of the Joy Industrial Complex. Told them their bodies were miracles and they ate it up. Sold someday, made money off soon and now. Snuck an ode into the elegy, Forced the dead to smile and juke, implied America, said destroy, but offered nary step nor tool. Paid taxes, knowing where the funds go. In April, offerings to my mother's slow murder. By May, my sister filled with the bullets I bought. June, and my father's life locked in a box I built. My brother's end plotted as I spend. IDKY, I told you it would be okay. Not. Won't. When they aren't killing you, they're killing someone else. Sometimes their hands at the end of your wrist. You, meaning you and me, are agent and enemy. There I was, writing anthems in a nation whose victory was my blood made visible. Mother, too sugar to weep without melting. My rage fed their comfort, foaming at my racial mouth, singing gospel for a God they beat me into loving. Lord, your tomorrow holds no sway. Your heavens too late. I abandon you as you did me. C'est la vie, but sweet Satan. OG Dark kicked out the sky. OG Dark kicked out the sky. First fallen and niggered thing. What's good? Who owns it? Where it come from? Satan. First segregation, mother of exile. What you promise in your fire? For a real freedom I offer over their souls. Theirs, mine's is mine's. I refuse any hell again. I've known nearer doubles, the audience and the mirror. They make you look weak. They clapped at my eulogies. They said encore, encore. We wanted to stop being killed, and they thanked me for beauty, and pitifully, I loved them. I thanked them. I took the awards and cashed the checks. I did the one about the boy when requested, traded their names for followers. In lieu of action, I wrote a book. Edited my war cries down to prayers. Oh, devil. They gave me God and gave me clout. They took my poems and took my blades. Satan, like you did for God. I sang for my enemy, who was my God. I gave it my best. I bowed, and worse, smiled. Teach me to never bend again. Cool. Word. All right, if you want to know where that goes, there's a book somewhere on sale. All right. I'm gonna read some newer poems to finish this out. I'm working on a book that is largely about time, because if you're a poet and you write enough books, eventually you write about time. And this is my turn. Word. What is this poem thinking about? This next one, there's a lot of poems in this one called Dear Time, which is like me speaking to time directly. And so this one is that, me thinking, trying to argue with this motherfucker, because we're always in a constant state of crisis, and I live in America, who engineers like 80% of the world's crisis. Y'all help too. Even though we're like about to fight, isn't that exciting? Y'all are like gonna cut off our energy, and like our president is like, we're having the tariffs, and then he like, I don't know, it's so funny. It has to be funny, or else you will kill someone or go insane. And I think I've already went insane, so I choose to laugh instead of killing people. Never mind. Can I say that? Y'all don't have the FBI here. Don't tell have your CIA not tell my CIA that I'm saying these things, okay? Cool. All right. Let me shut the fuck up. Dear time. How many knees wasted at the wrong altar? Thought I worshiped the future, but it was pleasure all along. Thought my prayer aimed for peace, but it was simply ease. Prayed stillness and received stagnation. Did not mean to land in the middle of the road. I was wishing for destination. At times, I feared complexity. At times, craved it. Sometimes wings and sometimes stones at my back. I wanted wings, wanted to fly to the end. I was sick of walking, sick of praying. I wanted to be where the prayers sought. Sometimes said my oppressors' words, the ones robbing our time, stealing us out of time. I wanted heads. I wanted to return to them their chaos. I wanted reciprocity. I wanted to take their time. I wanted to take time out of them. I didn't want peace. I wanted victory. I didn't need rest. I needed victory. Victory was the prayer I couldn't speak out loud without saying what victory required. So I started stuttering when I prayed. I wanted peace to be anything but still. I wanted peace to move quickly, destroy everything in its way. Okay. Yes. All right. I figured I should read something queer since the word is there. And, yeah, so this is like my little queer trans poem. It's called They, Them, because everybody was always like, you should write a poem about your pronouns. And I was like, fuck you. And then I was on my way to a lesbian wedding, and it came to me. I wrote a poem about their wedding, or about lesbian time. If I had time, I would read that poem. It's a very fun poem. But lesbians, wow, time moves all crazy around them. Okay. Maybe I'll read that one last. We'll see. But I wrote this one too. Cam, you're in this poem, just not to disarm you when your name pops up. Okay, cool. All right. They, them. Said short, I feel more like a stud. Said with some nuance, as if I came to masculinity through the women's gate. As if a daughter who grew into her father, but not like trans, but like trans, or a transformation without catalyst or smoke. Or more like being born in the right body too early, or born at the wrong time in the wrong language. I remember Tommy said is he a they now? Lived for how I put it in that one poem, quote, more tomboy than boy, and I think that's what language does, builds a room made for living. And who have I followed further into myself? Cam, Paula, Tommy, Fati, Andrea, Auntie George, or anyone who saved me from a body of silence by just living their lives in the sun. And if the soul is a table on which the body sits, crowded with the meat and the marrow and the red, red wine, around me sit too many ghosts to ever rest in isolation. Of course, you should address me in the plural. Said short, I am everyone. I am everything. Said shorter, I am. All right. I don't want to go characteristically over time, so no lesbians today. I know. Okay. Okay, I'll go a little bit over time. I'll read real quick. Okay. Great, hold up. Lesbian. Great, there it is. All right. Who loves the search function? Okay. Lesbian time. With thanks to Angel Nafis and Shira Ehrlichman. I can't tell if it moves like a river or a mountain. The U-Haul by the first Friday, a decade that feels like a Sunday. I think something about lesbians pleases time, makes her brandish her lush tools made of silk and feather, crack the rock for the sweet secret yolk inside to lather y'all with it. So long, I thought love wasn't for me, or I knew it wasn't love if it didn't feel like Angel and Shira, if it didn't feel kissed by the divine. I knew my husband was my husband because it felt like a woman loving into me, into the secret girl who rests next to my heart. What is a lover but a sister to your pleasure? What is a sister but the first one to be married to your living? I knew my love was for me because he felt like a homegirl, like the lady after me in the womb, like the one I shared a bed with who plaited my hair at night and went hungry so I could have bread. I bow to the temple of the architects of love. I believe in the God who took the bone from Adam and made his first revision. I need to see with my woman eyes if I want to go where love leads to water. I bend to be woman as the sea if I am to come into love's diamond breast. I must move like my sisters if I want to love my man right. Yes, 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 I got to be a good dyke if I'm to live my best life. Cool. All right. Tight. All right. Stop clapping. All right. One more poem. Then I'm out. We're going to sit down. Y'all going to ask us questions about time and lineage and whatever the fuck else y'all are curious about. All right. This is called In the Subjunctive Mood. In a Subjunctive Mood, which is a prayer with thanks to Cynthia Garza Rivera and Ashley Jones for their work. All right. In a subjunctive mood, a prayer. Wish be so, block where we could forever, dead end on which we if eternally. Inshallah, oh Allah, Almighty may be curving God's suggestion in our good favor. It is essential that faith open a door into the declarative, into the command, or not. A door where our possible seeks no conclusion. Let me not be too big for my bridges, but bridge us over that doubt and into the good advice of living. If paradise was to exist, I'd meet you there for tea. A hope in hand to promise your feet silk as water. If he walked on water, if he came out the cave a poet, if the sea was the first step into freedom's long song, if he is born again and again and again, and the child knows always his last life. If God has that many gates, I know there is somewhere where the end is not yet written, where we live unceasing, and the dead are still dead, but they live close as neighbors, close as lovers come the morning. If there is morning there, I know the birds are there. If the birds are there, I trust the map in their song. If there is a song, I know it's for no funeral. If there is no funeral, then what does our bravery have to fear? And if there are funerals, so what? If they kill us, we'll join the wind. If we win, what could hold us? What could touch? Cool. And give it up for the all-stars of the Queer and Trans Poetic Symposium. Come on, bring y'all asses up here. Let's do it.
Yes, thank you to all of you for sharing that with us. And we have some time for questions. Who's got the one about time? Yes, back there. Do we need to maybe do a microphone?
Yeah, I think so. Hold on.
You have to turn it on.
Thank you all so much, first of all, for your speeches today. It was really wonderful to hear from all of you. As requested, my question is about time. When I recently read Dion Brand's A Map to the Door of No Return, and one thing that struck me was the horror of being trapped in the present tense, and so many of you did talk about that horror that I found it almost fitting that you know, I should be dragged here today by my friend because I didn't know that this was happening until like an hour ago. So I really enjoyed that, first of all. But my question is, when we talk about this futurity, does it necessarily have a past? Because when we are trapped in the present, it is impending. We cannot save ourselves from what is happening around us. And so when Dion Brand is writing about Dessalines and how, Toussaint, you were my first love, but Dessalines, you were right. I guess the question is poetry part of that love that makes the violence possible?
Ooh.
I didn't even ask a question about time. Yeah, well,
What's on?
Hello, hello. All right. Is poetry part of the love? Or wait, say that one more time.
When we're trapped in the imminence of the presence, of the present, is poetry part of a love that makes the liberatory violence possible?
The liberatory violence possible, yes. I mean, I think poetry is part of the captor's violence and the counter-violence of liberation as well, right? You know, poetry, I don't want us to get like this idea that like poetry is like infallible, right? You know, there were poems that proclaimed manifest destiny over the land. There were poems that were read before great battles in our history of colonization to rally the hearts of the soldiers to go and take forward the task of empire, right? So I think that while the poetry that I think a great many of us like gravitate towards is the poetry that is based in love and rage and these things that leads towards liberation, our enemies love poems as well. The founding fathers, who one side of the American public would think about as heroes, who I think about as the highest enslavers and captors, were learned men who loved literature, who saw the country that they built in the poems and in the stories and in the philosophy that they read. And yet, they did not see my people as human. Or they unconvinced themselves of our humanity so they could do the violence that their dreams required. They had dreams, right? And dreams are not pure, right? Dreams kill. So yeah, poetry is part of it. In that thing, right, of like, you know, we're being trapped in the present tense. I think poetry is what helps us break out of that as well, right? I think, I don't want to speak for Dion Brand, but I would imagine that she is, from what I've read of her, is somebody that believes in that circle that I think Cam and Pauly were talking about, right? That was, will be. You know, that our past is intricately linked to our present tense in its horridness and in its shelter at times, leading us to the future, which is always speculative, right? And maybe we can try to divine where it's going. We can see a little bit in front of our face, but the future is something that takes such wild turns that we don't know really where it's going. But poetry is one of the things that we can offer to people to still believe in the future, which means that the present tense, that the conditions of the present tense are still surrounded by a lot of variables that can help us transform that future that we're all waiting to arrive at. Does that make sense? Cool. Thank you for the question. Anybody else got thoughts about that question? Word. Huh?
No, I don't have thoughts about that question. Yeah, but I think that I do want to ask the question. Danez, you clearly have a question for us about time, and I want to know what that is.
I don't know. Well, what is my question about time? I don't know. I feel like we all spoke to
Time. in our work in some way. I think all of us were thinking about our collective futures, our own futures. We were all bringing ancestors and elders in the room with us. I don't know what my question is. I was just like, that literally was just like, somebody should ask us about time. But maybe if I had a question, yeah, like I guess like, why do you think time was so present in all of our talks today? What do you think, where is time sitting in relation to these queer and trans poetics that we're all bringing into the room?
Yeah, I mostly work within lyrics, so the lyric has that capacity to create time unto itself, and then arrest everything else, and then focus the world into that moment, that memory. And if my personas are speaking to an ancestry that I believe had been stolen from me, then I'm able to recast that time so that the persona that I embody can speak to my ancestors. And then we are in that particular zone of conversation that I imagine, many in my poems, I imagine myself as a nun in a convent, or for some reason, a saint or a scribe in the Middle Ages. I try to embody myself in these women in history, especially in like 17th, 18th century Philippines, and so that I could imagine a futurity where I could regain that divinity. This is a tendency within many contemporary trans scenes of performance and creation. I can speak about my culture of trans artists born and raised in the Philippines, and trans artists who are living in Australia, in the United States, in Europe, but who want to reclaim a particular trans history. And I think that is both a gift and a curse, because there's a tendency to essentialize that particular temporality, to return to that so that one may understand the present, and then not realizing that the particular past had been replete with violence into itself. Like my ancestors sold each other off as slaves to other tribes, and then even when accounts say that femininity, femaleness was not based on biology, still there had been distinctions between the feminine, and the trans figure becomes ancillary to that female figure. And none of us in that particular paradigm are willing to tread upon the violences in that particular past. So, and it's a conversation that's going on among my colleagues, how to navigate that particular past so that in the futurity of creation and performance, we're able to sing about our hope and the pain that are in that particular moment of arrest. So the lyric is able to arrest that temporality, that world. However, as a poet, as poets, we must be wary of the particular repetitions of violence that can be inherent in that particular suspension of temporality, because that temporality should sure us into a particular futurity where if ever a repetition could happen, it would not be the same violences of the past. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
hard to follow. I was thinking that poetry might be like lesbian time in the sense that poetry can slow you down, it can speed you up, it can connect you to different moments in history, different moments of yourself, different moments in the future. And so poetry in and of its nature is about, you know, altering your relationship to time, which then alters your relationship to the object and objects or situation of the poem. And so I do think that it is, that question, I think that time comes up so frequently because it is the way that we think about approaching changing our relationship to things. And so we try to bend time and we try to bend it for lots of different reasons, sometimes really beautiful ones, right? And sometimes really violent ones. And sometimes we're aiming for beauty and we produce violence. But yeah, I think there's a desire, at least, and I can't speak for my co-panelists, but there's a desire in me to reach across time to my beloveds in the past and to take them with me into what I hope is a future. And so that theme is always just gonna keep coming up.
I guess maybe on the question of time, I'll say one tiny thing and then return it to the audience is, yeah, I mean, I think that when I say that I am in a room as Cameron Awkward-Rich, the poet, rather than the scholar, I think that what I mean is that I'm in the room to move toward what I do not yet know. That for me is what poetry is about. And I think that in that Polly piece, but also in the book that it comes from, the thing that I do not yet know is how to want the future. And so I think that for me, I had to wrestle with, yeah, my own feeling of stuckness in the present, my own kind of inability to attach to the future tense, but also to the way in which trans and other forms of oppression, but trans oppression in particular in the United States, tends to operate by always locating transness as something that is impending, that is coming. So the trans child is never here, but is always in the future. So therefore can be warded off by, for example, an executive order. And so I think that for me, the question was a question about like how to bridge the feeling of stuckness in the present with the feeling of stuckness in the future, right? That these two things that felt like they couldn't actually ever touch, because the way that my body is positioned in time is as one that does not yet exactly exist, even though I walk around. So poetry helps me do that because it is a little time machine, because it can arrest time, because it can bend time, so on and so forth. Yeah, does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes. Yeah.
And maybe, yeah, oh, Keith is running with the
Where's that microphone? Yeah, thank you.
You deserve a raise,
Thanks, Keith.
Hello? Okay. Hi, thank you so much for your presentations. I really felt the complication between beauty and struggle in these poetics, specifically and most explicitly from Mejdulene and Danez. And I wanted to ask, how do we avoid glamorizing and making a spectacle of our struggle in ways that might orientalize us, while still engaging in a meaningful poetic practice?
Thank you so much for that question. I think that's really hard, to be frank. I think that when I first started writing, I was like an open wound, you know? My friend told me, you're so Catholic, you're always confessing, you know? And I was raised Catholic, so it checks out. And I've tried to work with that and tried to refuse that because of the ways that it becomes commercialized, because of the ways that I've commercialized it myself. Like, I remember writing my essay for graduate school and talking about difference, you know? Fuck me. But I got into grad school. No, It was wrong. I mean, it was right, but it was wrong. You know what I mean? And so my instinct about this question is that, and this it feels so basic, so I apologize that this isn't going to be some like amazing thing, but my instinct about the question is that we can't control how our work is received and by whom. And so I am writing first and foremost to the people that I love, the people that I support, the people I am in solidarity with. And for them, I will be beautiful. For them, I will be open and share my pain and gather theirs and try to do something with them. And if these motherfuckers are eavesdropping, what can I do about that? I can't. They're not my primary audience. I don't really care what they do anymore. Yeah, that's not who I'm talking to anymore.
Yeah, we're twins. You're using all my buzzwords when I get questions like that. But I think, the eavesdropping is a real thing, right? Hold your primary audience at the center. I think instinct was a really big, if I'm just pulling out like little words from what you said, instinct is really big. Trust your instinct, trust your gut. A word that maybe I add to that list is just caution, right? Listen to your own sense of caution. Review your work not from a place of trying to tear it apart, but from really trying to ask like what you see as the divine and the pulsing questions within your work and about how you want to move it towards other people. One question I asked myself in particular when writing about the violence that Black folks endure globally is if the mother, it's just like a kind of hypothetical. If somebody's mom was in the audience when I read a poem in which the death of their child was implicated, could I read that in front of her? Could I read it in a way that doesn't feel like it is just putting her through that trauma again, but rather trying to curtail and fight back against the world that killed her child in the first place, right? And if I hold something like that towards it, I think it changes the way I write, and then it makes me, sometimes say like, oh, I think I'm just like reanimating the violence. I'm not doing anything to move past it, right? Or to, sometimes reanimation is part of it, maybe. But I have to be sure about that moment, right? And then I just keep a little list of people whose opinions matter. Opinions are like assholes, but some people's assholes I care about. And so I keep a little list of people that are in my life as like editors, writers, people that are just close to me, or people that are like hypothetical, like the mothers of XYZ, right? These are the people I'll listen to. And all I can do is write in that place of risk that I might fuck it up, but I have a short list of people whose opinions I will let influence the way I write in the future if that feedback ever comes to me.
We have time for like one more question. Who's gonna? You're raising your hand though.
Sorry. So, perfect. So my question is as well when you're writing in terms of like, as well, because it's kind of as Cam had mentioned, as you mentioned, bridging the gap between those two spaces and also like finding those lyrics, getting grounded, tapping into that rage, tapping into that time. Like I try to write as well, but it's just been hard to kind of feeling that block because I guess it's about lineage, my question then, about when you look at your inspiration, when you look at your past, when you're trying to put words, what do you do when like most of your past is kind of erased by history, when most of your ties to things are kind of not there? And like, yes, that's something to write about it in itself, but as well, I guess, how do you kind of go against frictions of that?
Do you want to throw your question into the mix too, and then we can kind of, yeah.
I just wanted to ask, what is the relationship between hope and poetry for you?
You guys are so rude. I just want to, I don't know that I'm not going to start with the hope question. I'm going to start with the other question about how do you write and create these connections when your history is being actively erased, right? That's the question. I think that Saadia Hartman has this practice she calls critical fabulation, where you sort of work with the remnants, the ephemera that you have, and you let the effective emotional reaction you have to that ephemera sort of move you towards the imagination of the thing. I also think that there's a difference in scale, I guess, like in a personal history versus a history of a people. And so you do have a personal history, right? Like you did not emerge like Athena from the head of Zeus, you know? Maybe you did, I don't know your life. And so you can access those histories and do the same sort of project of thinking through your affective and emotional ephemeras and what that might yield. Yeah.
I think that's brilliant. Yeah, I think the canon's got to start somewhere, and so why not with you? Right, like if we go back through history, right, there's a lot of our long histories that start to become a lot less legible or a lot harder to find the further back we go. I think critical fabulation is a great tool to bring into mind, right? But just, yeah, so I think, I don't know, I think about those horrible firsts, right? What does it mean to be like the first person to publish, you know, in the language that your people are not in, or whatever, you know, you're the first. That's wild. The first trans woman to publish a collection of poetry in the Philippines, that's wild. It's overdue. But because there is a first, now there gets to be a canon and a history, right? And so, you know, that is, I guess, maybe the bravery that it requires, right? That maybe you don't have as much of the past to stand on, but what you are is now going to be a foundation for the writers to come, who, you know, like, history is not just behind, it is also forward, right? And so write wonderfully for those who are either not yet born or who are waiting for your utterance so they can start their own. That gives me great hope. I'll say that as well. To me, I'm a pessimist, like a motherfucker. But poetry is one of those things that helps me train my hope back into my future. It reorients me not just on the downcast movements of society, but rather, you know, that there still might be an up somewhere along the lines. I think, for me, I guess, like, when I think about poetry, it's like there is a kinetic exchange that happens between reader and writer, right? If I didn't care about how people felt about my poems, I wouldn't publish them. And I think for me, the role of the poet, of the public poet, the publishing poet, I do have to have, there is some agreement here. And my half of the agreement, and this is personal, I don't think every poet has to feel like this, but mine, I've always, I think, agreed that, like, whenever I publish something, I want, even if I'm like, doom, 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 murder, 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 it's all bad, I still would like people to exit my work feeling like something else is possible, right? And so, and that is hope to me. Hope is the idea that the doom that I exist in is not constant or forever, right? That there is a door or a window, an exit somewhere. There is transformation that is possible. And so I guess for me, yeah, hope, like the larger project of my work, I guess, is like, how do I offer alternatives? Alternatives sometimes sound like hope to other people out there. So yeah, that's my goal, I guess. And overall, I don't know how they're related, but I hope that, I don't know, I feel like we all got a little bit of, Billy Ray Belcourt, man, maybe that's what he's trying to get at, right? Like, the beautiful sentence can maybe confirm something in you that inspires something like a hope to keep going? All right.
I'll say two very short things. The first is that I think that when I felt as though I did not know how to access like a particular history to write in relation to, what I did was I looked around me and I thought, who are the people who are my we, who are writing right now, who are also my kin? I don't know, like without Danez, I would not be a poet. You know, without our friends Fatia and Jamila and Sam, I would not be a poet. They were, yeah, they were my lineage before I went looking for it. So there's that. I think the thing about hope, I'm gonna say something weird that I don't know that I agree with, but I'm gonna say it anyway and we'll see. So I said this thing, right, about poetry is the kind of way that I come to know what I do not yet know. And I think that when I think about hope, I am always thinking about the last chapter of this book by the political scientist Kathy Weeks called The Problem with Work, where in this very last chapter, she's like doing this funny argument about people think utopia is stupid, but it's actually not. And she makes for me this like really helpful distinction where she says that hope is at least two things. It's the affect, but it's also like a critical capacity that we can train. That I think that she says via some other philosophers is like the opposite of memory, right? It's a way of training the capacity to think forward rather than think backward. And that even though I am a person who is like, I don't know, I think constitutionally incapable of the affect of hope, I am capable of training my kind of like cognitive capacity to think forward rather than backward. But another thing she says there, which is like, I think the thing that it's hard to agree with, but which I think might be true, is that actually the thing about hope is that it is the opposite of fear. That fear is the thing that makes us want so badly to make sure that the version of us that we know right now in the present will live into some kind of future. But she says this thing, which is basically like, in order for the world actually to be different, then we have to be open to that idea, right? That like what we are actually hoping for is that the versions of us will not exist, right? That like actually there is like a fundamental like radical transformation that would have to happen, and that like true hopefulness is about like letting go of the preservation of the past, the romanticization of the past, and instead, yeah, like being open to what we do not yet know. So that for me is poetry.
I'd like to speak of, I love the question of the relation between hope and poetry through the internal mechanism that happens in the creation of the scene or the world or the feeling within poesis itself. You know, in the poetic time that is conjured at the moment of articulating that I want to write a poem, there is already an intention to be in an exercise of uncertainty. And that is where hope becomes more of esperanza, to wait for something that might not arrive, and yet invest in that particular expansion of time within that tiny opportunity to risk oneself into failing, even if you might actually fail. But in my experience, there is, a poem might come as a gift, like it will stop you in the middle of a task and you just have to surrender to the totality of a poem that's already within your being, and that it arrives in white heat. But also there is a poem that calls upon you to create it at the sheer ask of the methodology itself. and that is the most difficult but most rewarding poesis task of creation, because every step of the way you are part of the method of making the hope happen, even if you did not know what it would become in the beginning.
I will say something just very short, because what is left to say, really? But I want to agree with the idea of hope as a critical practice. And I think hope, for me, is always the question of what do we owe one another? And what I owe my ancestors is everything, right? What I owe them is to to refuse to disappear, is to refuse annihilation, is to insist on love, insist on life, to fight really hard for them and for the people that are with us right now and the people who will become later. And so, yeah, what do we owe one another?
Thank you all so much for coming all this way to share this beautiful work with us. And whether or not it saves any lives tonight, and it might have, you did share beautiful sentences. Thank you very much to everybody here for coming and for everybody here for participating in this event. And one more final round of applause for our guests. Take good care, everybody.